Parliament breaks in the next few days for the summer and won't be back till September. An annual opportunity for us to get a lay of the land. This year, something a little different, some questions that try to give us a sense of where the country is as the summer of 2014 approaches. Everyone's at the table tonight, so let's get right at it with question number one. Looking at all the evidence in recent elections and the political posturing we've witnessed in the past little while, do we think Canada is moving to the left or to the right? Andrew?
I'm not sure you can find much of a trend one way or the other. I know people will like to trot out bits of data on either side of the divide, but when you look at the totality of it, you could say, look, on the Ontario election, Kathleen Wynne ran to the left and she won. She's got a new social program in the form of a larger pension plan. On the other hand, you look federally and you've got all the party leaders disavowing tax increases of any kind, keeping the budget balanced, open to free trade agreements. These were all used to be unimaginably right-wing ideas. They're now the status quo. And I think the biggest bias is towards the status quo, with two exceptions. One is, I think, on the social issues, we're unquestionably moving to the left. We look at the advances on gay rights. If you look at the changing attitudes towards legalization of drugs or prostitution, I think it's pretty clear. On the economic issue, I think for the years to come, it's going to be conditioned by the aging of the population. Is going to put such constraints on any ability to have an expansionist program beyond healthcare, I think is out of the question. And globalization and our participation in free trade agreements. Those are going to be lasting constraints or conditions on the political agenda for decades to come.
So you don't want to pick one or the other then?
I'm saying neither one nor the other.
Okay, Chantal.
I think stubbornly centrist. I don't see that we veered to the right or the left. I looked at the Quebec and the Ontario election. It's interesting, the similarities. Yes, most people voted for governments that actually believed that the state has a role to play, an activist role in society in both provinces. There was a refusal of extremes on the left and on the right. And moderate conservatives, at the end of the day, determined the outcome by voting, not voting conservative or voting more for the Liberals, or in the case of Quebec, where everything was played to people to the right, by choosing the middle course of the Liberal Party. I'm not sure on social issues that legalization of marijuana, same-sex marriage are left issues anymore, in the same way that I don't think that free trade is a right of center issue anymore. So I don't see that as a sign of anything but societal evolution.
Well, you know, Peter, I think there's been a thesis that Canada has moved to the right, and I guess I would say I just don't see enough evidence over time to support that thesis in my own mind. I do agree that on things like free trade and the size of government, the role of government in the economy through crown corporations, people have moved generally towards a more conservative posture. But I don't think you can really look at society overall and say that there's been a big shift. I think in addition to the Quebec situation, if we look at some of the other provincial elections where Canadians had a choice between moving to the right or moving to the left or staying pretty much in the center of the spectrum, in Alberta there was an option of moving to the right. People said no. In Ontario, they could have moved right or left, and they didn't. In BC, there was a chance to move to the left, and basically they stayed with the more centrist party, I think. I think 70% of Canadians are what I would call progressive centrists. They're cautious about fiscal matters, but that's where they sit most of the time.
All right. So overall, no big change then?
A mixture of things. It's just hard to say one trend, no.
We don't have in this country a party, a mainstream party that says, let's get rid of Medicare. Let's make social programs private. We actually have more of a mushy middle that's spread to the three main parties than anything else.
Well,
and even if
sort of, you know, after 8 years of a conservative government, I know Andrew would argue about calling them a conservative government, but after 8 years, there's been no major change in terms of the kind of thinking of Canadians?
Well, there's been subtle changes, but they're evolutions on a kind of in a practical direction. I think basically people here are pragmatic, and if they look at some solutions that one would have associated with the left in the past and said those weren't working that well, government was costing us too much, wasn't doing what we wanted it to do, then we'll move in this direction. But if we look at the situation of the Republican Party in the US and the Conservative Party here, the Republican Party's worst problem is the Tea Party. It's a viable, strong movement within its party. Doesn't look like it's going away. Here you occasionally have conservatives say the problem is red Tories, but I think the reality is in order to win elections, conservatives here need red Tories and they need blue Liberals. and they can do with a little bit less of that Tea Party type steer.
All right, let's move to the second question. The economy, and we kind of touched on this a little bit here, but the economy is often cited as the key issue facing Canadians. Is it the key issue? Andrew?
I think, broadly speaking, yes. There's a school of thought that says, none of these scandals or abuse of power or any of these things are going to matter for the Conservatives come the election. It'll just be about the economy. And to the extent that that's true, it's a card for them. They're going to be able to go with, free trade agreements and tax cuts and balanced budgets and probably unemployment below 7%. It's very hard to defeat a conservative or any kind of government when it's in that kind of situation. I think it's possible to get it onto other issues for the opposition, but they've got to reassure people they're not going to mess around with the economy. They've got to connect the democratic reform agenda, if they want to pursue that, to the economy as well. They've got to say, look, if we're going to make the kind of hard choices and difficult decisions we're going to make in the years to come to do with the aging of the population, we're going to need a politics that has open to new ideas. It's going to be a politics that, when people come to these decisions, they're able to get consensus and buy-in from that. None of that really works, as we're seeing on, for example, on the Gateway Pipeline file. None of that works if you're trying to run everything by one person out of the Prime Minister's office. So if they can say, look, democratic reform, a more open, inclusive type of politics also means more progress on the economic front, I think they can make that issue stick.
Chantal?
I think the economy is a litmus test of the real issue, which is perceived competence. So if the economy is going well, you get some credit for perceived competence, even if actually you're probably not a major player in the economic setup. If Quebecers vote for a Federalist Party, you get some credit federally because they didn't do the opposite, although you probably have nothing to do with the outcome. But the real issue is people want to know that you are able to tie up your shoelaces and not fall flat on your face, and you must demonstrate that. Because when you look at economic prescriptions, at the end of the day, they all look pretty much the same. I also think that when people respond to the economy, they don't just mean a good balance sheet on all of the above. They also want, if not a government that is actively in the economy, a government that is engaged in their interest and on their behalf and trying to make the conditions as good as possible for them.
Bruce?
Well, I think there's always about 20% for whom the economy is the single most important issue. These are usually the most distressed people in society. And for them, change in economic direction is necessary because things can't get worse. There's another 50% of the public, though, for whom the economy feels like the most important thing that maybe government can do, but mostly they're fearing that government will do bad things to the economy. And some of them fear bad things to the right, and some of them fear bad things to the left. So as long as all parties are competing more or less around the same space, no radical ideas emerge, the economy won't be a central issue, in my view, in the next election. However, to Andrew's point, if it starts to appear that some parties are looking a little bit more radical, and that's where I think the risk lies for the Liberals, particularly on this Gateway debate, is that if they look like they only want to talk about it as an issue of political management as opposed to economic management, they run the risk of not looking like the serious economic managers that people want if they're looking for an alternative government.
And in relatively good economic times, though, people stick, as we've been seeing, they stick with the incumbents. There's a school of thought that says, well, people like to shop around when there's good times. You just can't find any evidence of it. You have to go back to 1957 to find a majority government that was defeated when unemployment was below 7%.
Unless there's some other overwhelming issue.
I haven't seen a trend that was meant not to be broken in all of the time that I've covered politics. So yes, that is true, but to me it is not a precursor of an election outcome in any way, shape or form, because other factors come into play, cyclical change. All things being equal, the choice between two valid candidates, maybe I'm tired of you and I'll try you. Even if the economy is good.
Don't say that.
No, I'm sorry.
All right, we're going to run out of time here, so let's try to get a couple more in here. Mood for change can often be a decisive factor in Canadian politics. What's your sense? Are Canadians in a mood for change or not? Bruce?
Well, given there's only about 35% who say they would vote Conservative if there was an election tomorrow, then ostensibly 2/3 of Canadians would like to have change, but they don't obviously agree on what change. The more important thing, and I think that we saw in the Ontario election, is how desperately do people want change? People can want change in their lives, in their jobs, in politics, but not really do very much about it. And I think Mr. Harper can do something to reduce the instinct to want change or the intensity of that instinct. But to do it, he has to reach out and try to charm more voters rather than simply do the kind of attack my opponents thing. And I think his opponents have to be careful not to take that mood for change for granted, because I agree with Andrew that people do have an instinct that they voice in favor of change, but they also do an awful lot of voting back incumbents.
Chantal.
But when they do vote for change and they find change, it happens in a major way. Think of what happened to Jean Chrétien versus Kim Campbell. That was change of a major order. The Bloc Québécois and the Reform Party came about in that election. No one could have imagined change of that magnitude. So yes, it can happen, but I don't see in the polling numbers a sign of change in the sense that, yeah, almost 70% of Canadians would like the Conservatives not to be in power. Well, it so happens that they voted that way in the past 2 or 3 elections. So it's not a sudden thirst for change. It's an appetite that's been there not to have Conservatives in power.
Right. And you always have to keep in mind that in the last election where they won a majority, 60% of Canadians didn't want them there.
And it's true in virtually any election, I think was what we're saying. I guess I would only add to that is our electoral system magnifies and exaggerates we all get very excited. Well, there's been a historic shift here, and it'll be 3, 4, 5 percentage points of the electorate. But generally speaking, if you look at within that system, what's been happening in recent elections, people have been, by and large, returning incumbents.
Question 4, has any politician or party captured the mood and tone that Canadians want to hear? Chantal.
I think they all have a trust deficit in different ways. I think there is clearly a trust deficit for Stephen Harper in the way that he's executed and implemented some policies. And also, the time and power has hurt the brand of his party and the brand of the Prime Minister. But I think the NDP has not overcome a trust deficit on the front of what it is and whether it is a possible economic manager. And I think Justin Trudeau, personally as leader, has not yet bridged that gap either.
I agree with that, but if you're talking about tone, I think the party and the leader that have come closest to it is Justin Trudeau. You know, he's been at the top of the polls ever since he came in as Prime Minister, as leader. A big part of that, obviously, is name recognition and his family lineage, et cetera. But part of it is, I think he struck a lot of good notes in terms of less confrontational, a little more open to change, a little less dictatorial, et cetera. Where he stumbled, of course, is most recently on issues like abortion, where he seemed to be more dictatorial, and I think there's some lessons to be learned there. But generally speaking, I think there is a response to that, and he's got some other hurdles to overcome in terms of people doubting his competence or his experience, et cetera. But I think tonally he's been very good.
The puzzle about Trudeau, and it must be driving the Conservatives nuts, is that when he does stumble, and he has made more than a few stumbles, he doesn't seem to pay a price, if one believes
I think that's part of the benefit of having grown up in the public eye, is that people think they know him and that they incorporate this into, oh, well, that's okay, we know that about him, but we also like these other things. And if you can get in that position as a politician, like Ralph Klein in Alberta, for example, where people just go, oh, well, that's Ralph, you're in a good spot. You can't overdo it. If you have too many stumbles, then people just go, well, you're an idiot. But I think at this point, they're still giving him the benefit of the doubt.
Bruce,
all 3 of the main party leaders have days when their tone is just about right, I think. Mr. Harper's best days are on those days when he's kind of sober and thoughtful, looks like he's hardworking, and sometimes when he takes the opportunity to explain in long-form interviews what his government is about and what they're trying to do. Those days are relatively few, I think.
He's so good at it. You wish he would do it more.
He should do more. It would be in his interest to do more. I think that there are days when Tom Mulcair really captures the mood of Canadians around issues of frustration with abuses of power and spending and that kind of thing. I don't think he's been very effective at capturing the mood of Canadians on economic management and the future of the country and those kinds of things. I think I agree that Justin Trudeau is probably the most effective. I think his hope and hard work message and that kind of notion of perpetual optimism, I think, is something there's a very big market for, and he seems to know how to tap into it.
All right. Good discussion. Interesting idea. You must have loved it.
I did.
Time to talk. There was a 5th question, but you all talked so much that I never got to it. I'll save it for the next one. Thank you all. They're off for a break at issue now for parts of the summer, but obviously if something happens, they'll be back. We'll find them no matter what lake, cottage, fishing trip they're on.